G'day, mate. What's up, party people, and welcome to the Josh Corbett podcast, where it's not my opinion that matters, but yours. In episode 4 of this series, we'll be discussing the gameplay of Final Fantasy VII as we break down the systems designed to have us coming back for more than simply the story and the characters of the title. The following conversations feature Final Fantasy superfans Brian, Danny, Hodgepodge, Kira, and Mike, who you'll hear even more from in coming episodes, and a huge thank you to them and to all the callers who took part in this project. It wouldn't exist without them and their dedication. Please be aware, this podcast series is riddled with spoilers regarding the plot and characters of the game. If you've not played through Final Fantasy VII before, please play it and enjoy the fantastic story and come back afterwards. I repeat, spoilers are coming. But with that said, let's get into it. As much as we discuss the characters and story of Final Fantasy VII, suffice to say it would all be for naught if the game simply wasn't fun to play. The gameplay mechanics, customization systems, and minigames of Final Fantasy VII all help factor into forming one of the more memorable gaming experiences of all time, rather than simply being just a memorable plot. While the game delivered what could be termed a standard JRPG turn-based combat system, the game added extra layers that would help to engage the player's mind as they considered the best tactics to employ on their journey through the hostile world of Gaia. Coming off of the Job and the Esper system in previous titles, the developers of Final Fantasy VII concocted the Materia System as the way in which players would unleash spells and abilities.
It's probably actually one of my favorite systems they have done in the very few Final Fantasies I've played. Just the fact that, like you said, the combinations on the weapons, the linking of multiple materia to combine powers to make them even stronger. And I mean, it's basically a necessity to get through some of the end game bosses to be able to level these materia up to the max level and utilize their, like, for instance, you get the ×2 cut early on in the game or later in the game. You have to get that thing to ×4 or else you're not going to beat either of super bosses. Like, the materia is very important to the combat. And if you don't really focus and put time into it, you're not going to succeed in the end game.
There's just so many possibilities with the materia system. The way that you can link certain materia together, you can use elements to your advantage, you can use status to your advantage, or you can do it on the defense. You can protect from certain elements or certain status effects that you may not be able to deal with otherwise. My only gripe about it looking back as a long-term fan was that in the end, if you know what you're doing, there's not as many opportunities as I would like to actually capitalize on that knowledge. But I felt like that was a really, really cool system. I would love for them to expand on that. And obviously we have the remake coming out. I think it's going to be just amazing in that as well.
Just to expand a little bit on that tangent, Kira, I think you're referring to possibly this, because I've always had this thought as well. If you are the kind of person that does like to min-max the game and really go nuts with materia and get everything to the best level and do all this crazy damage, are you insinuating that if you take the time to do that, there's actually not a lot of content towards the end game to play around with it?
It's not so much that there's not content, it's just... there's no incentive to delve deep. For example, I mean, you can definitely say, you think about like the super bosses, right? There's not a ton of status ailments, for example. There's some of them for sure, but there's no point where you think, okay, I've got to put bio and added effect on my armor, or I have to use Hades for this, or I have to capitalize on that elemental weakness. Because most of the time it's like, okay, I'll just equip a ribbon, and then there we go. And then I'll just equip the mistile. Or if you really are like a hard grinder, it's like, okay, well, I could go with 3 people, or I could just go with a Barret and mime counter anger max 8 times. There we go. So some of these eccentricities of the materia system I felt were really, really cool, and I would love to see more of. But when it came down to it, there weren't a lot of enemies at the near the end of the game or in post game content that made you have to stop and think about it. You could do that, but a lot of times you could just, kind of just go with it with the best weapon, with rapid fire, and with like mimed element or mimed limits, and there you go. Really, like you weren't forced to get into that. You weren't forced to do those really cool things with the system.
The Materia System put a new spin on an old framework in giving the player a way to customize access to specific abilities amongst the members of their party. But with other Final Fantasy entries having done something relatively similar before, gamers were left to ponder which system they preferred.
Honestly, it's pretty much up there as either my favorite kind of character customization system or next to favorite. You just think about back then when the game was first released. You're going back to 1997, and yes, the internet is a thing, but people aren't researching things left and right anywhere back then the way that they are now. So the Materia System was such a cool thing in that there was just a whole lot of exploration involved, right? If you didn't go read the strategy guides, you didn't pick one of those up. If you just want to experiment for yourself, try different combinations, half of the fun was just in exploring, hey, how do these combos work? I totally remember one of my favorite parts of my first playthrough of Final Fantasy VII was getting Final Attack, getting Phoenix, and realizing, wait a minute, if I link up Final Attack and Phoenix, then I'm fine. And
Brian, you stole my entire talk track. That was the thing I was going to talk about because it was so good. You're like, I am a god.
But I'm sorry for stealing your thunder or your fire there. But honestly, just the exploration and the discovery of all the cool combos that you could put together there, and then like in later playthroughs, finding other combos that you didn't even consider, just made that system so amazing. And I feel like the Materia System not only was big for Final Fantasy VII, but you think of other games and how they would do skill and ability customization systems. One that really comes to mind that's kind of close to my heart because I'm a Blizzard fanboy and all. You think of Diablo 2 and you think of the Rune Word system. I feel like there was a lot of inspiration in that system taken from what they had established with Materia in Final Fantasy VII.
I love you so much. I'll just keep it as I love the Diablo 2 reference.
The different materia combinations left open to the player resulted in a deep system, where players could experience vastly different levels of difficulty in battle depending on which materia they had equipped, leveled, and paired. This led many players to turn into mad scientists on the search for some of the best combos in the game.
I was absolutely the same, like middle of the road kind of gamer. However, my brother was the power gamer, so he had a save file with every materia maxed out, and that's where I kind of went to play with them. But it did remind me a little bit of, it's the only system that kind of incorporated a little bit of like programming, a little bit of like an if-then, with like Final Attack, and you kind of had these combos of linking these pieces together. And I think it was just great, all kinds of things that you can do with, Final Attack or different kinds of counters or cover. There's a bunch of them all together in there. But the system as a whole was just so fun to play with. But to circle back, I think Kira brought this up, that the problem with it, I felt, was that you almost never got to use them because they weren't that important. Because by the time you leveled everything up and you had all the materia, your characters were so ridiculously powerful because there's a giant gap towards the end of the game between the standard like disc 3 stuff to do and the super bosses. There's I think a giant gap there. So it's like when you get things like Final Attack and Phoenix and put them together, I think it was a rather small window where that was actually like really, really useful. I mean, it was a fun little thing you could do, but if you just spent the time and really powered up your characters, I don't think anything gave you too much trouble. But if you tried to use that against the super bosses, it didn't really work because you needed very specific setups for them. So I think a lot of those things ended up getting lost just a little bit because it was fun to play with, but you never really needed to because your characters were just OP by the time you got all of it. So that was the only, I don't even want to say weakness because it is one of my favorite systems in the game, but I think that's why it may not have been um, as deep for some people who just played through the game regularly. In the power gamers at the end found every combination, but it kind of hit a weird middle ground there where it kind of fell short.
I would just jump in real quick and say I totally agree with you on that point. And if you look at some of the people that are playing Final Fantasy VII now, and by that I mean like the original game, you can play it for PC or whatever like that. You get the version for PC on Steam. There are people that have come out with mods for Final Fantasy VII, adding extra encounters, upping the difficulty and such like that. One very popular Twitch streamer in the Final Fantasy VII community, as far as that goes, Maximilian Dude, recently did a playthrough of modded Final Fantasy VII, and within that modded version, actually having that high-end materia ended up being kind of a big deal and pretty important. So people found a way to make that stuff relevant years later.
Are you talking about New Threat?
Yeah.
Oh yeah. If anybody wants that challenge, you've got to play that. I've played through that 3 times. It is so good. I'm not really a mod guy, but that was honestly 11 out of 10.
Real quick, just before I get Mike to finish this up on the Materia System, what's that you're referring to that Rose brought up that you're just referring to now, Kira?
It's a mod by Sega Chief called Final Fantasy VII New Threat that basically changes everything in the game. Like, you know how the remake, it has like character-specific abilities and stuff? The New Threat mod makes it so that everybody in the original game also has unique abilities. The enemies are a lot harder. They have completely new AI. There's just so many changes, even to like the fundamental mechanics. Like I was talking earlier about how you could basically, in terms of status ailments, you could just equip a ribbon and be good. But in New Threat, for example, it kind of discourages that easy out because the ribbon now protects against anything, including haste and barrier and M barrier. So if you want those buffs, and oftentimes you really need them to survive, you can't have that ribbon on. Another unique thing is like there might be an enemy that breaks through your immunity. Well, if you get hit with a status ailment and you have ribbon and it doesn't protect it, you can't cure it because it nullifies status change. And between that and all the different weapon system, the different materia, it really forces you to think about what you're doing, or else you're just going to get steamrolled as early as mid-go.
Okay, interesting. Now, Mike, I'll throw it over to you to kind of kick off the end of this topic. And I'd ask you, do you have any favorite combinations that come to mind, materia that you absolutely couldn't wait to get, or the combos that you couldn't wait to mess around with? And also, has anyone raised any of the points that reflect your feelings towards the system?
Yeah, so going back to what Kira was talking about, when you first start the game, you play through your first time, you're exploring the materia. It's, really cool trying to figure out the combinations. Again, this was, back before the internet had really taken off. So you go to school, you talk to your buddies, and you share combinations and stuff. You go home and try them. One I remember thinking up, especially, I don't think anybody's talked about this yet, but being able to take a single piece of materia, if you've mastered it, you've got another one like Comet, pair that with Quadra Magic and then pair it again with MP Absorb. So now you've got 2 supports on the same magic that you're using. It could be really powerful, really cool to figure that kind of stuff out. When I think of a materia that I just can't live without, really just for quality of life, is probably Double Cut or Slash All, just to kind of take down those mobs. But again, like other people have talked about, it's when you get to the end, you aren't facing, the real huge challenges. Yeah, you've got the optional bosses, but typically you're just mowing down enemies. So you kind of figure out what work as far as materia combinations go, and you just go with it. And especially on subsequent playthroughs, you just know what's coming, so you just go with it. I think in general, the Materia System, it's not one of my favorites compared to, especially like the job systems that Square has put out. I was a really huge fan of Final Fantasy Tactics. Loved Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy IX has it to an extent. I think the system was sufficient. Back then, I hadn't played a whole lot of Final Fantasies, so I thought it was pretty exciting. But now I just think it's sufficient. I'm really excited to see what the remake's going to have. I have not played the demo yet, but we'll see where they take it. I mentioned Slash L, but then I didn't mention when it levels up becomes Flash. So you pretty much just wipe everything out.
I was going to say, you're not a real Final Fantasy VII player if you haven't used W Summon and Knights of the Round and sat through the entire thing.
Oh, yeah, that's how you have to beat the Ruby weapon.
Yep, the minutes wasted watching the exact same animation. I remember going back, my wife was playing through it, and she's like, do they play these every time? And I was like, welcome to 1997. This is how we did it. Grindy games and super long summon animations.
Minutes wasted. I mean, that's when you go to the fridge and grab a drink.
On top of the Materia system, another new system embraced by players was the introduction of limit breaks, something that would also feature in future entries in the franchise from this point on. I will never forget what it was like to first unleash Braver, with limit breaks being a system that was welcomed with open arms by myself and many other players. Character designer Tetsuya Nomura. In Final Fantasy VI, we had Desperation Attacks that would happen when you were near death, and I wanted to build on that idea. Since you were free to build your character by adding and removing materia, I also wanted to add limit breaks as a way to bring out the individual, innate personalities of each character. For that reason, I'm really glad we were able to include them. It also allowed us to add more unique animation for each character too, further emphasizing their individuality.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I think the thing you were referring to in Final Fantasy VI was actually the Desperation Attack, where I believe it was if you were below 1/8 health, you had a 1/16th chance of getting those big hits. Personally, when I played 6, never ran into them because I was always healing. So I never even saw them until after I beat the game. But I think that the limits in 7 were so fucking... The only thing that I didn't like, the only thing they needed to change was do it like Final Fantasy VIII, which they kind of learned, where you didn't block out the attack by having a full limit gauge. Other than that, I thought it was honestly pretty damn close to perfect. Absolutely loved it.
There was one limit break system in particular that I was just absolutely addicted to, and that was Tifa's limit break slots. Just learning how to master the timing on slots, having your eyes follow the reels, and just getting used to that timing and being able to reliably line up the best limit breaks that you could on slots that was good times. I think I liked her limit break more than any other.
You are a gambler, sir, because it was my least favorite for that reason. Oh, gosh. Kira, you were going to say something there, mate.
Totally agree. Tifa, badass, best girl, best limit break.
Red 13 has Stardust Ray, and I don't know to this day how much damage that does, but it looks like an ass load because the numbers just keep piling up and keep going. I'm like, that's infinity damage. You can't even quantify how much that is. So little things like that, or I don't know, those always flavored mine because I didn't rationally think about, what characters were best or what stats or who had what. It was just like, nope, the limit break Stardust Ray, it's overpowered. I don't even need anything beyond that because that is the highest quality you can get. It's got so many numbers all at once. You can't beat it.
I will say really quick, while I loved Tifa's limit break, Kate Sith's was absolutely miserable.
Oh, yeah.
I could never succeed on that.
He was just a miserable character.
Yes. He uses a megaphone as a weapon. I'm like, I'm done. I'm out.
Now, I love Vincent's devil limit break. That thing is just, I love that. I can't get over how much I love that it always had him in my party just because of it.
Yeah, I was gonna say Omni Slash is solid.
Yeah, it's
but
too good.
Barrett's Catastrophe does really well with Emerald Weapon as well. So I would definitely throw him in there. Yeah.
Isn't there one that allows you? I think it's with Barrett. You can do the damage overflow glitch, or is that Vincent?
You can actually
There's a
do the
couple.
overflow glitch with all, depending on
Oh,
your
well,
setup.
well,
Wow.
there you go. I never knew,
I-
but I knew the overflow glitch existed, which is, for those of you out there that don't know, it's basically the damage gets high enough, it's some multiple of 2, I believe, but it overflows the bits and shows a weird number, but does like infinity damage on the back end. It just goes beyond what the game thought would be possible, and usually requires a pretty specific setup. It's not something that you would encounter regularly in the game by any means.
Outside of combat, Final Fantasy VII offered players a plethora of gameplay distractions for whenever they wanted to take the time to wander off the beaten track and see what other experiences lay in wait. This quote-unquote extra content, if you'd like to call it that, ranged from combat-related to outright quirky, and perhaps nothing was quirkier than giving the player the ability to breed their own chocobos.
I definitely got heavily invested in the chocobo breeding. And, I don't even remember how I figured out all the different combinations and the different nuts you feed them, and whether it's, a great male with a good female and whatnot. Obviously, now I know there's the chocobo sage on the northern continent, but I know it was a mixture of that and just talking to my friends and us all just kind of figuring it out together. But, I was super into getting all of the greens, feeding them at the right times, feeding the parents and then feeding the children before racing them, just to make sure to get the 999 stamina and get as much speed as possible, which I guess really doesn't matter in the end, because once you get the gold chocobo, you're good. But I just found the racing to be so much fun. I definitely sunk so many hours into that.
The odd thing about the chocobo breeding for me is that, again, playing this in an era where I wasn't really using the internet or strategy guides too much, I was just kind of exploring stuff for myself. I actually, in my very first playthrough, did not get Knights of the Round, because I didn't even know Knights of the Round was a thing after I beat the game the first time. And there were a lot of side stuff in the game that I didn't do in my first playthrough. So after learning about Knights of the Round and that you need a gold chocobo and all this extra stuff involving chocobo breathing, that was probably the first time that I actually went into outside resource material to look that stuff up, because I was like, how did people discover this? How did people figure this stuff out? Because I thought the breeding and the racing was cool, but I think other aspects of the game attracted me more in my first playthrough, and it was cool to learn the whole breeding system the second time around. I was just kind of astounded by the depth of it, and for me, I just kind of skimmed over it.
I totally did the same thing. Like the first playthrough, I just didn't even touch it at all. I was like, I don't want to mess with this, because I was a little kid, didn't really care for it. I don't even think I probably beat the game the first time around. Then once I returned to it back in college, I couldn't help but use a guide to get through it and everything. But the reasoning behind it was because this game has this large overworld map, and there's something about games with huge overworld maps with all these hidden little secrets on them that I can't help but want to explore every little bit of them, which needed a golden chocobo, hence why I got into it. And then once I got into it, I found it was incredibly fun and addicting. The racing is so fun. I love it was a great system. I loved it all.
Yeah, there's so much. It's so much to that. I think of my first playthrough, and you'd walk up to a random thing and you'd hit something, and then it'd pop up like Turtles Paradise newsletter number 4. And you're like, fucking cool, I guess. What the hell is this? And there was so many little breadcrumbs throughout the game that back in that time, I don't know if you ever really could figure it all out. My brother and I eventually got the strategy guide and pieced the things together, but man, there was just so much, and you would accidentally stumble upon little tiny pieces of all of this stuff. But to try to get it all together in one playthrough, unless you sunk literally hundreds of hours, I'm pretty sure you were not going to be even close.
Throughout the narrative of the game, mini-games are flirted with at several junctures, from a squat competition at Wall Market to escaping Midgar while hacking and slashing on a motorcycle. Eventually, the player winds up at minigame heaven in the Gold Saucer, with an extensive range of games available that could eat up another 50 hours of the player's time simply on their own. But why was it that we got as many amazing minigames as we did? Game director Yoshinori Kitase. We thought of the bike minigame where you escape from Midgar, but apart from that, we had no plans at all. Now, we don't have staff who aren't working on anything, but back then, we could have staff who had a bit of free time between projects. There were some new staff as well, so kind of doubling as training, we had them make things that needed specialized programs, like the roller coaster shooting game or the submarines.
Oh yeah, it's so good. I think that was just such a magical place. Basically an amusement park in the sky, but I just love the whole, hey, I know the meteor's gonna kill us all, but I really fucking need to shoot some baskets, bro. I love that. That was so fun. It was that one for me, it was the snowboarding minigame, and it was the G-Bike minigame. I could not get enough of that. That was just like, all the games have, or, well, I shouldn't say all of them, but a lot of them in the series had some really cool minigames, but outside of Chocobo Hot and Cold, there were not any that could just live up to the Gold Saucer. It was so much fun. It was like you were a kid again, right? It's so fun.
So I just want to really quick, before I toss off the other people, just to kind of give people listening in a little bit of an idea of the depth of what mini games were like in Final Fantasy VII. I'm just going to read off a short list of most of the mini games, and I'm going to miss like 3 or 4. You have squats early on in the game. You have the G-Bike, which you can play in the Golden Saucer. The Fort Condor minigame. Snowboarding, which is playable in the Golden Saucer. The submarine game. The roller coaster shooting game. Of course, you have the chocobo racing and breeding that ties into it. Arm wrestling, dating Moogles, feeding a Moogle some nuts so that he can hook up with some female Moogles. There's a crane game, a rock, paper, scissors game. The amount of mini games in Final Fantasy VII was absolutely freaking insane. I remember the Breath of Fire series, which is another popular like JRPG series. I love the fishing mini game in Breath of Fire, right? When I played Final Fantasy VII and ran into over a dozen mini games, that was just absurd how much extra content that had next to nothing to do with fighting monsters and building up stuff had anything to do with it. It was just mind-blowing how vast and big the amount of extra additional systems were to this game. And the mini games are probably one of the reasons why they needed one of those discs out of the 4 that you need to play it.
Anybody do the Speed Square, the roller coaster laser zappy game?
Oh, that was my thing.
No, yeah, there's no balance whatsoever. You could hit something for so long, and it would give you like 10 points, and then you hit this tiny little hidden icicle pixel, and it gives you 1,000. It was the most broken garbage game I have ever played, and I sunk so many hours into it.
Same.
It's so
good. Just remember spending
you
so
needed a
much
turbo
time trying
controller
to
for
get
that
the
one.
parasol.
Oh, I had one. It was the best.
Racing is where it was at, just to get the GP. Because you'd go into Wonder Square and you'd be tapping the button on the arm wrestler, so hard and working so hard, and then at the end you win and you're like, yes, and you get 1 GP. And then you head over to Chocobo Racing, you trade in like, a potion for 10 GP. So that's where it was at.
I grinded out the GP to get that XP materia. That was quite the grind.
Well, we didn't touch
definitely
on it too much, but Battle Square.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I was gonna mention that. Spent a lot of time in there, just as much, if not more, than the Chocobo Racing to get Omni Slash.
The Coliseum mini game for Final Fantasy that's probably appeared in practically like half of the Final Fantasy games, and getting Omni Slash was definitely a must thing.
Yeah, it was almost like a little bit. It had the same characteristics as a lot of like roguelite games that they have now, whereas just enough random. You had a little bit different enemies. You had a little bit different, hindrances that you would spin on that wheel. I
Right.
remember spinning and it'd just be like, yep, you can no longer use any of your good materia, whatever brand that was. And you're like, all right, sweet. Or, your MP was gone, all the different things. You could just get something that hosed you. But that's something that I think actually gives a lot of replayability to games still today, is they utilize that kind of random mechanic.
It makes me wish
Yeah.
that was in remake, but I doubt we're going to see that because remake at least the first part of remake only covers Midgar. But there's so many things from Gold Saucer that were so great, and it's kind of frustrating to realize that unless they do something really radical and different with the plot and the storyline, we're not going to see any of that stuff for a while.
They could still do a Coliseum.
Possibly. That is possible.
The extra content of the game wasn't all a bit of tongue-in-cheek fun, however, as the game's developers plotted ways in which to truly challenge elite players on the battlefield. They achieved this through optional bosses that remain fearsome to this day in the imposing Emerald and Ruby weapon.
Genius.
It
I
makes
remember
me giddy.
floating around in the sub, and then you just see that thing, you're like, haha, let's run into it. Oh, shit.
Oh my god, if that game didn't already give me nightmares with Genova's fucking headless body in the Shinra mansion, that was the thing that scared the shit out of me. Going down underwater, and it's like, holy shit, he's right there.
Yeah.
I remember
had that,
dying
like,
a lot of times.
They had that, like, nice soothing music when you were underwater, too, like, everything sounded great, and then you hit this thing, and you died every time.
I didn't know what Ruby weapon was at first, and I walked right up on it and stumbled right into that encounter, and that was a big fail.
I'm really surprised from, a challenge perspective that the weapons were in the US version and not in the Japanese version. You'd almost think it would be the other way around.
They would
Well, they had
eventually
to-
be out in Japan in like the international version. They would come out with a later version in which they could be playable in Japan. But yeah, they made their debut in the US.
Have we got anyone on the line now who has taken down a weapon and invested the time to be like, well, fuck this, I'm going to take this challenge on?
Oh yeah, I've taken both of them out. They're quite the challenge. I think my Ruby weapon took me when I really started putting the time into it. I had everything for the most part maxed out. Knights of the Round ×4, everything. I think it was about 7 attempts, and the worst was when I had probably about 30 to 35 minutes into the attempt, and I just slipped up my input on Yuffie and didn't heal my party, and then I wiped the whole thing. I think that was one of the most angry moments I've ever had in my entire gaming career. But after I finally succeeded in beating Ruby weapon, it was just one of the most satisfying accomplishments you could ever think of. You know what I mean?
You mean after you bought a new controller and television?
Of course, right.
Yeah. I took down both. I think what was more fun is I know in a storage box in the back room in my house currently, I have an old memory card, and on there's a save file with, of course, it's the one I reference with. It's all my brother's characters and everything's maxed out. There's, I think, like 350 hours on that save file. But I have one character currently saved on there at 7,677 health. Ready, if you don't know, if once you hit 7,777 life, you trigger an event called All Lucky Sevens, which I thought was going to be really, really awesome and is a bit boring, but still pretty cool. And just the fact that I have that sitting in storage, I always like that little tidbit. Certain people, if they know the game really well, if you say that first part and they get excited.
Guys, in terms of the optional bosses that we do tend to get in Final Fantasy titles, I'm being reminded on Twitch at the moment by listener Lukash here, who's saying, the Final Fantasy VI Dragons, of course, and other titles do give us these rather incredibly difficult optional things that obviously have great rewards usually. Where do you guys rank the weapons? Do you think that they're the OG, they're number one, or do you think that Square kind of went above and beyond in titles to come?
I mean, for their time, they were pretty great, and they set like a foundation and kind of set a high bar for them to do similar things later on in the series. I think that they did better with optional bosses in later games in the series, but if it weren't for what they did with the weapons in Final Fantasy VII, I don't think we'd see the boss encounters in later games, the optional bosses, in quite the same way. I was always a fan of the optional fights in Final Fantasy 12 of all things. That's like my favorite one for like side boss battles with Zodiac particularly, but the 7 battles are fine.
Final Fantasy X's got some great secret bosses as well, like
Mm.
Unaleska, like the monster that attacks you in the very beginning of the game. Like, it's got so many good ones in that one as well. And the
Dark
airship
Aeon's
to be able to
Penance.
travel around the. Oh God, so many good ones. Anima, like, ugh.
On top of the core gameplay, optional bosses, mini-games, and bonus content in general, Final Fantasy VII contains some content that lies behind the gates of the choices made by the players themselves, handing some sense of agency to the player to determine how certain smaller elements of the story may unfold was a much heralded move by Square. We've discussed in earlier episodes one of the larger examples in the Golden Saucer date scene and who Cloud ultimately takes on that date, but there's perhaps a more famous example that we haven't quite touched on yet.
I was so ecstatic to see that was in the trailer for the remake, because I was really worried it wasn't coming, but there's no better feeling than beating both Eris and Tifa when you go in there. And you get chosen as the female. Oh my God, is it so funny, man?
I just hope that
hilarious.
they have the line where you can totally choose to flirt with them, and they're just
Oh, man.
like, oh, come on, baby, what's wrong? It's like, oh, baby, you've been doing me so fine. I just want to see him like really play up that flirtiness right before he just rips it off, and then of course we have the whole like where they're basically
I'm gonna
threatening to
cut your
cut his
unit
dick off.
off.
Yeah,
Yes.
they gotta have all that.
Oh man,
I'm
it's
gonna
gonna be
crush
great.
it. Yeah.
I'm gonna cut it.
I was worried that they were gonna like cut it out because realistically, it's one of those issues that can get you in trouble just with the day and age that we're in. Not that there's anything right or wrong. This is not a political statement either way, but I could see them making the stance like, hey, you know what? We just don't want to touch that. Just not something that we want to, infuse into the game. And then I saw the trailer and they're like, oh, you thought we weren't going to touch this, and then just hit that dial to 11. And I'm so excited because that's what made the original game so great, was there's these little moments where things are so ridiculously out of place in the best way with the rest of the game that it just felt more organic because you did have these weird intricacies and these weird different areas. So I'm just so excited that they really chose to drive that one home.
Of course, one of the primary things when you think about choices in Final Fantasy VII is, of course, are you Team Tifa, are you Team Eris, or are you one of those people that went on a date with Barrett in the Gold Saucer? But those little things just kind of add to the replayability and making the experience unique and such. And I really, thinking back on like the games I had played before that, I don't think I'd ever really played a console game. I mean, I'd experienced some choice games like that, playing on a PC, but I never really experienced a console game, let alone a JRPG in which they had like that, just those little subtle choices, and then having them come back at a later point in the story and mattering just made the experience all that much better.
Yeah, I would have to add a point to that is I think it really goes a long way to the quality of the game and the narrative, just because these little things, as tiny or as relevant as they may be, they really help build your connection with the characters. Like an example would be, of course, we know Stephen King is a phenomenal author, and he's known for many things, but one of the things he's known for is his horror. And somebody asked him once, why do you think people love your horror so much? And he said, well, I find that if you care about the characters, the scares generally work. And I think that general mentality can be spread to this as well. Obviously, we know about, for example, Aerith's tragic fate, but we wouldn't really care if she was just some dumbo or some bimbo slum drunk, like nobody cares. But the fact that it goes through all this effort to really build these characters and make them feel alive and add in all these organic things, it's not all serious for the planet. There's a lot of silly shit in there too, and it really makes you feel like they're not just a character, like they're your friends. So that
A
one
perfect example.
No, go
A
ahead.
perfect example of that is you look at Final Fantasy 15, and there was a female character death in that one, had nowhere near the impact of Eris dying in Final Fantasy 7.
Exactly. She was like tissue paper. Nobody gave a shit. She was just so flat. But with Final Fantasy VII, the characters, we love them because it's these little moments. I mean, like, even look at Marlene. You don't even play her, but going up to Cloud and be like, "Hey, Cloud, I think Aerith likes you." And then if you're just like, "Oh, maybe," and it's like, "Yeah, let's hype it up." Or if you're like, "No, I don't know," she's just like, "You stupid head, get out of here." Shit like that is
and
fun.
Then you get
it makes it feel
emotional when
real.
you see Marlene and Calm near the end of the game.
Exactly. And that's why I think we're doing this, because Final Fantasy VII is deep and so rich that I think the way that they did these characters makes us care about them. And that's why it's so impactful, because every time something good or bad happens with these characters, we actually feel like it matters and we're invested with this.
I'm looking forward to jumping over the hump of hearing the characters talk and communicate, and you can see reactions. There's so much at the beginning. Actually, this is how I got introduced to Josh in this whole podcast. He was talking about, 1997, you didn't have voice acting. You didn't have, really advanced CGI. You had these weird polygons and you had text boxes, but then you had the music as well. And that's just one of those things, like, I think that's why the music of the game, you talk about the connections you have with all of them. Certain bits of music, like Eris's theme, like as soon as you hear that, you're just like, okay, all right, here we go. It just takes you back so much because you have these connections with music and you're kind of playing these characters out in your head a little bit. The timing of things was at your own pace of reading, but there was a video. It was just a very unique medium at the time. And I'm just so looking forward to seeing that switch to a more modern style, and I really hope it has all of the same impact.
Final Fantasy VII was faced with the challenge of making the JRPG popular to the masses of the Western market, and merely having a fantastic narrative would not have sufficed. Luckily, as you've just heard, the game came with great gameplay, enjoyable combat systems, and fantastic bonus content that kept gamers coming back for more and more in multiple playthroughs, and is one of the key reasons behind its immense popularity to this day. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Josh Corbett podcast. If you liked what you heard, then please do continue on to the next episode of this series as we continue to discuss arguably the greatest JRPG experience ever made in Final Fantasy VII. You've just heard a number of fantastic voices. Please take a moment now to hear more on who they are and where you can find them online if you'd like to discuss anything you heard here further with them.
Yeah, so basically just Cry of the Planet on Twitch. I do challenge runs with Final Fantasy. I did not mention this previously, but I do put up the videos on YouTube as well under a different name. I do a lot of Final Fantasy Tactics. I've been doing 10, stuff like that. So if you're interested in that, definitely check me out.
You can find me on Twitch, ZBAPOC. I don't stream, but send me a message. Love talking about all things JRPGs or ARPGs, stuff like that.
Sure. So I'm one of the producers for a number of podcasts over at Warcraft Radio. You can go to warcraftradio.com.
You can find me over at Twitch. I am the Danisaur is the Twitch name. I normally, as of late, have been speedrunning Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, little old school NES for you.
This series features quotes and information obtained from the following sources: Square Enix, Polygon.com, TheLivestream.net, Schmooplations.com, Wikipedia, the Final Fantasy VII Wikipedia, and GamesRadar.com. I'll include links to the relevant pages in the show notes for each episode, which I do highly recommend people read if you're a huge fan of this game. The Japanese quotes recorded for this podcast do not all feature the people nominated, with voice acting and translation provided by the amazing Oni Dino, who you can find over at the fantastic Nintendo Everything podcast, which I also highly recommend listening to. But with all that done, please do join us on the next episode, as there ain't no getting off of this train we on.